Hello, welcome to this video. We are going to be taking a look at a question that I got recently from someone who was reading some of the tutorials, watching some of the videos, and the question was about how can I query the permissions on Tableau server and get all the permissions for, let's say, all of the workbooks that you have in your environment, and then be able to do something with that information. So what we're looking at right now is the final product where we're going to be. This beautiful Tableau desktop workbook is, nothing special here in terms of the visualizations, not trying to visualize anything, just trying to show you that we now have this interactive environment where we could specify various, usernames. Maybe we just want to see, how this specific user, like what permissions do they have to all the various workbooks that we have. Or we could just say for a specific group, what are the workbook permissions looking like for this group, or any other kind of thing you want to do that's just using the information we can pull from the REST API about workbook permissions. So this is beneficial if you're trying to do anything that's like data governance related, or you want to be able to track exactly who has access to what in terms of content in your Tableau environment. And we'll probably follow up with additional videos and articles on specifically focusing on data sources, views, and projects. So for this one, we're focusing on workbooks. All right, so let's take a quick look at some of the resources that you have out here for understanding the topic a little bit more before we dive into the code on how we get it done. And for starters, there's a written tutorial that's going to accompany this. It's currently submitted to a publication. I will link this in the video, so it should be available by the time this video is published. But you can follow along with this, and it's really going to go step by step, no joke, literally step by step, screenshots of the code at work, and then of course at the bottom we have the code in a nice convenient way available through a GitHub gist or gist. Not even going to get into the GIF versus GIF pronunciation. I say GIF, so I guess I should call this a gist. I should probably know how to say that. Anyways, this everything that we're seeing here is made possible by the Tableau REST API. So I can't stress enough how everything that we do in the tableau-api-lib library, which is the Python library we're going to be using to make things come to life, everything that we do in there at the end of the day is making use of Tableau's REST API. So you can always look at the Tableau REST API documentation to understand the limitations of what we have, the boundaries of what's possible using the API itself. And of course, you could write your own code from scratch if you don't like using someone else's library. And also, there is, of course, Tableau's own official REST API library for Python called Tableau Server Client. With all of that stuff said, we're making use of numerous endpoints here. All of those are actually called out in the article. So query workbook permissions, query workbooks for site, groups, users in group, users on site. All this stuff is going to be packed into the code we're about to write. And speaking of the code we're going to write, let's hop on in here. And just want to call out that we are using tableau-api-lib. So if you do code from scratch, or if you do use Tableau Server Client, you're not guaranteed that the various functions I'm using here exist over there. You're either going to have to rewrite it yourself, or you're going to have to figure out what the equivalent implementation is, or you can just use tableau-api-lib. You can install it from the Python package index. You can just go pip install tableau-api-lib, and you're good to go. So over here, we're going to run through this. I've got some imports. Of course, we're importing pandas because we're working with data in Python. It's the best way to do that. We have Tableau API-lib's Tableau server connection, which allows us to talk to our Tableau environment, and we have some utils functions. So we're going to be making heavy use of the querying functions, which lets us query various pieces of information and get that information as a pandas data frame. We are going to be flattening nested columns of information, and we are going to be flattening some other things. So let's cross those bridges when we get there. Here we have the configuration defined, and this is an example of something you would never want to show anybody. Don't ever show anybody your configuration details. I'm going to have to delete my personal access token and secret after this video so that nobody gets in and starts tinkering around with this environment. But this does show you what you could expect to be setting up as you get started, making this work in your own environment. So let's go ahead and run all this stuff. Reset the kernel, run the code, and the very first thing we're going to do is connect into our environment. So we do that using the sign in method. 200 response code means we were successful. Now we're going to initialize an empty workbook permissions data frame. And this is something that over the course of this Jupyter notebook that we're in right now, we're going to append things to this. You'll see the same thing out in the code that's shared with you if you were just to copy and paste that into a script and run it. So we have ourselves an empty data frame that we're going to be dumping data into as we go. And we also want to get information about all of our workbooks. So we're using this handy get workbooks data frame function that the Tableau API-lib provides, which will make use of the query workbooks on site or query workbooks for site endpoint. And we already do all the pagination and everything with this function. So even if you had 1,500 workbooks and hitting the API by default only returns you 100, this is going to iterate over, do all the pagination and get you all of those workbooks into a pandas data frame. So that's going to look something like this. Now up at the top, we imported something called flattened dict column. Why would we ever need that? Why do we need this guy down here? Well, because we have some nested information here. So we are going to be talking about the permissions for each workbook, but you might have workbooks named the same thing in different projects. If you have a project called test project and another one called production project, and you have the same workbook names in both of those folders, you might want to know which project it is you're working with. So we're going to unpack some project information here. This is like the project ID and the project name, so that when we have our final output about all of these permissions for our various workbooks, we actually know which project is relevant as well. All right, so we ran that. Now let's run this code where we are flattening the project information. You can see what I mean by flatten, right? Up here we had name and ID and project. Project had some nested information. Down here, this code that we have, we've renamed work ID to workbook ID. We've renamed name to workbook name. And then we also unpacked from this nested information the project ID and the project name. So now we have these happy 4 columns: workbook name, workbook ID, project ID, and project name. So at a high level now, we already know what all the various workbooks are, which projects they belong to, and what the identifier in the server is, so that we can make some additional API calls to get information about those workbooks, such as the permissions that exist for them. So now we are going to scroll on down and we're going to get some information about our groups. The reason that we're doing this is that the permissions that exist for our workbooks, these permissions can be assigned to groups, and you can have permissions assigned to users. So we're going to handle groups first, and we get this information about our groups into a pandas data frame, again using one of Tableau API-lib's functions called getGroupsDataFrame. And this gives us information that looks like this. We have the ID of the group, we have the name of the group, and we have some other information about the group. So very quickly, we are also going to, for each group, query the users and bring all of the users that belong into that group into a data frame with that group information. Because at the end of the day, what we want in our output is, what project are we looking at? What workbook are we looking at? What are all the various permissions that exist in this workbook for any given group? And who are the users that inherit those permissions from the group they belong to? Of course, then finally, we're also going to add in information about permissions assigned to individual users. But let's hold on before we talk about that. So we run this information that's for each group, iterating through each group, querying the users that belong to that group, and joining that stuff together. And we're just going to let this run. Won't take more than a few more seconds. And then we can actually take a look at what the output looks like. So let's say all group users data frame. What is this looking like? So we can see that this gives us all the users, their IDs, their site roles, and it also tells us what group that user belongs to. And of course, a user could belong to multiple groups. So let's see if we were to sort values by username. Take a look at this output. And we can see that here, this Sid Highwind, don't know if we have any Final Fantasy VII fans out there from the original Final Fantasy VII. Not bragging, but it's throwback. We've got this person appearing 3 times. So we have this person belonging to 3 different groups. Apparently they're a Bitcoin manager, Litecoin manager, probably not doing too hot right now with the market being in terrible shape. But we got Bitcoin managers, Litecoin managers, and then all users. So we can see that this data frame is giving us all the groups that we have, all the users that belong to those various groups. Now, why do we have that? Well, because we are going to iterate through every workbook in our arsenal. We're going to be querying all the permissions that are relevant to that workbook. And then all those permissions are going to contain either all the capabilities for groups or all the capabilities for users. And for each group permission that's described, we're just going to join in all of the groups and all of the users in that group that are relevant to that permission set. Idea being there that later on we'll be able to look at Sid Highwind over here, and we'll be able to see what are all the permissions that Sid has for all these various workbooks. And we get that information because we joined in the groups relevant to the permissions, and we joined in the users relevant to the groups. Sounding like a broken record right now. If you don't like listening to me repeat this stuff, just go follow along with the article. But we're almost done here. So we are iterating through this. I'm not going to go through in every meticulous detail what's going on here. But essentially, we are querying the workbook permissions for each workbook. We're extracting some information that we care about using the flattened dict column again. And we're extracting all of the capabilities associated with all those permissions using this other tableau-api-lib function, flattened dict list column. And then we're just assigning some extra information in here for context. So we want to preserve what the workbook ID is, what the name is, what the project name, the project ID are. And then every time we loop through for each one of the workbooks that we iterate over, we're appending to our data frame that information that we collected. So the data frame we initialized at the very beginning of this monologue, at the very beginning of this tutorial, that's the thing that's getting appended to here. So we can see that as we run this code, which I should run, it's just going to cycle through literally, every workbook that we have access to. I should mention only Tableau server administrators and site administrators can do this. So if you are a regular user on your server environment or on your Tableau Online site, you're going to have to talk with your team and figure out how you can get site administrator privileges or server administrator privileges in order to actually do this. Okay, so now we've cycled through all of our workbooks and we extracted all of the group level permissions that were defined for that content. Now, it's also possible in your permissions models that you assign permissions to specific users or that you deny specific users permissions to things. This is why we are going to cycle back through all the workbooks, and we're going to say, okay, let's also add into this data frame, this master data frame we're creating, all of these user level permissions. By the way, you should not use user level permissions. I'm doing this because some people have them, but I highly recommend you don't do this. Ideally, your permissions model in your server is that you lock permissions to the project level, and then you assign groups permissions, and you would always assign users to groups in order to delegate these permissions. You don't want to have, like Andy Johnson and assign them a unique permission. You would rather have some kind of, all these various groups that you need, like, admins, sales managers, finance reporters. You want to have as many different purposes that you would need for permissions. You should have those concepts organized into groups, and then assign users to those groups, and always manage your permissions through groups. Cannot stress enough how much easier that's going to make your life in managing all the data governance stuff in Tableau. Okay, anyways, done with that preaching. So we query all the users first of all, again using the tableau-api-lib function that grabs us the information we want as a pandas data frame. And we are going to cycle through all of our workbooks, and we are going to get the permissions. Anytime that there's a user level permission defined, we're going to execute this code down here. Otherwise, we just continue through the loop. So there aren't that many in my environment. There aren't any user permissions. I added one, I think, just so that this example would work. And we'll see that after we run this. We can see it's going to move pretty quick. Do keep in mind, if you have thousands of workbooks in your environment, the bigger your environment is, the longer this is going to take to run. So just be aware of that. And also be aware that the size of the data frame that you have at the end of the day is going to be dependent on how many workbooks, users, groups, and permissions rules you have. So here I have almost 4,000 different rows that end up in this data frame, and I'm going to output this data frame to a CSV file. So that's one of the nice handy things about having put all this data into a pandas data frame. It's very easy to output to a CSV file. And let's hop back into our Tableau workbook so we can just recap here. This under group name that I've decided to filter by in this very barbaric visual I made. This is showing us, for each group, for each project, for each user, what are the workbooks, the various workbooks relevant here, and what are the various permissions that are either allowed or denied to that user or group. Now remember, I said I don't have many user level permissions here, but if we wanted to see all the user level permissions, this is going to be falling under this group name null. That just it's null because if you have user level permissions, they're not associated with any group. Now, that doesn't mean that this user doesn't belong to any groups, but it does mean that these permissions we're looking at were assigned to a user, not to a group. And in this case, we can see that we had denied this user certain permissions. Just so you know, user level permissions override group level. So even if this user, so let's see, how many times does this user show up? So this user is a group of all users, and this user is also, let's just see here. That's only, okay, so this person is only a member of the all users group. So even though they're allowed access to this workbook here by membership of being in the all users group, because we set a user level permission that's denying them access to this specific piece of content, that's going to override the group level permission. But like I said before, it's a bad practice to set user level permissions. You should avoid them if at all possible. And I think that's a wrap for this demo. So once again, if you want the quick and dirty version or to do this at your own pace, do find the article. I will link it in the video. And of course, the code is here for you to adapt to your own environment if you want to do so. So good luck and hope to see you in future videos.